When a chestnut stallion, scarred but proud, steps into the auction hall, silence cuts through the crowd like a blade. No one wanted it until one man's bid stuns everyone. This is a story of redemption, resilience, and revelation as one event. Ignites a bond forgotten by the past. The stale scent of dust and sweat clung to the walls of the auction hall like an unwelcome memory. Beneath the bright artificial lights, voices swirled, sharp, eager, driven by wealth and greed. Men in starched collars and polished boots leaned forward with eyes gleaming at the promise of prestige and power that came with owning fine bloodlines. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip through the thick air, each bid building upon the last, like the roll of distant thunder. But when he entered, the noise died. The chestnut stallion moved with the heavy grace of something once magnificent, like a crumbling statue of a god who had long since been forgotten by those who once worshipped him. His coat, dulled by neglect yet still catching fragments of light in copper flashes, stretched over sinewy muscles that trembled with quiet tension. His eyes, dark as a storm-churned sea, scanned the crowd with something between fear and defiance. A scar marred the left side of his neck, jagged and cruel, cutting through the sleek beauty of his form. No bids came. The auctioneer cleared his throat, voice faltering for the first time that evening. "Prime lineage, this one," he announced, though even he couldn't mask the edge of desperation. "Stallion with a fine history. Any takers?" The silence thickened. In the back of the hall, George Callahan shifted in his worn leather jacket, the brim of his weathered hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much of life's sharp edges. His gnarled hands, roughened by years of sun, wind, and heartbreak, rested on his lap as if weighed down by ghosts. He hadn't meant to be there, just came for supplies, maybe a look at what the auctions were peddling these days. But the moment that stallion entered the arena, something hit him square in the chest, sharp, unexpected, and suffocating. That scar, those eyes, that carriage, proud, even beneath layers of neglect. A memory surged, years old but clear as fresh-cut glass. A chestnut stallion, racing across golden fields, mane ablaze in the sun, the sound of hoofbeats, a heartbeat all their own. A name formed, unbidden, behind George's clenched teeth. Duke? He couldn't breathe for a moment. It couldn't be. His Duke was gone, had been for years, disappeared without a trace from his ranch one storm-dark night. He had searched until the earth bled dry beneath his boots. But Duke had never returned. The auctioneer was about to move on when George stood. A murmur rippled through the crowd. No one noticed him before, just an old rancher, worn down and forgotten like the stallion before him. But now all eyes snapped toward him as he raised a steady hand. 500, George said, voice hoarse from disuse. The silence thickened further. A few snickers rippled from the wealthier buyers. What use did a worn-out man like him have for a horse like that? But no one else spoke. No one else dared. "Sold," the auctioneer said hastily, gavel striking the wood with finality. The hall emptied soon after. George waited, heart heavy in his chest like a stone lodged between his ribs. As they brought the horse to him, closer than before, the realization struck him even harder. Up close the scar was unmistakable, an old wound healed poorly but deeply etched in his memory. The stallion flinched at his touch. "It's you," George whispered, voice cracking like dry timber. The handler thrust the reins into George's hand with a mixture of pity and disdain. "You're wasting your money, old man. This one's broken. Ain't worth the feed it'll eat." George ignored him. As they left the auction grounds, the stallion's steps were heavy but steady beside him. Each movement was deliberate, like walking was an act of sheer will. George could feel the trembling beneath the beast's muscle, fear, layered thick beneath that battered pride. The sky was beginning to bruise with the last light of day, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked earth like reaching hands. The ranch was still a 2-hour ride out, and as George drove the trailer back through winding roads, Memories clawed at him. Duke racing through open fields, the wind cutting through the grass like silk, the smell of leather and earth, laughter, once bright, now buried deep beneath layers of regret. When they reached home, if it could be called that now, the land greeted them in silence. The barn sagged under the weight of time. Fences leaned as though they, too, were tired of standing. George unloaded the horse slowly, cautiously, giving him space, but offering quiet assurance. The stallion, Duke, it had to be Duke, stood under the fading starlight, nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of the familiar land. His muscles twitched beneath his chestnut coat, memories perhaps stirring somewhere deep beneath the layers of fear and neglect. George didn't expect miracles, not yet. But as he watched the horse lift his head, something flickered behind those dark eyes. A question, maybe. A sliver of recognition. "Welcome home, boy," George murmured, voice thick with everything left unsaid. The night air was cool and sharp, carrying the sounds of distant coyotes and the whisper of wind through dry grass. George sat outside the stall long after the horse had settled, if you could call it that, just watching, just being. He didn't speak again. There were no words strong enough to bridge the chasm of lost years, but in the silence, something fragile took root, a beginning. The days that followed were carved from brittle patience and quiet persistence. The sun rose and fell in its steady rhythm, painting the sky in hues of fire and lavender. But inside the worn fences of George's ranch, time moved differently, like a slow trickle from a fractured dam, hesitant yet inevitable. George gave Duke space, understanding instinctively that too much too soon would only shatter whatever sliver of trust might be stirring. He remembered the horse Duke used to be, spirited, proud, with muscles rippling beneath a gleaming chestnut coat as he tore across open fields with reckless joy. Now that memory felt like a cruel echo of what remained. The horse before him was thinner, his body marred by hard years and harder hands. The once vibrant fire in his eyes had dimmed to cautious embers, flickering beneath layers of trauma, but George didn't push. He showed up every morning with fresh feed, clean water, and gentle words spoken into the open air like offerings to the wind. His hands never reached for Duke without permission. He knew better than to invade that fragile space too soon. Sometimes George would just sit near the corral, sipping bitter coffee from an old metal mug, letting the horse get used to his presence again. Days turned into weeks. The first breakthrough wasn't grand. No cinematic reunion. No sudden burst of recognition. It was something much quieter, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. One morning, as George stood by the fence line scattering hay, Duke didn't flinch. His muscles didn't tense like they were preparing for a blow that wouldn't come. Instead, his ears twitched toward George's voice, and for a fleeting moment, his dark gaze settled on the old man with something more than fear. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it wasn't terror either. Progress, George thought. A start. The ranch, once neglected, began to stir back to life as well. Fixing the broken fences became George's first act of intention. Each nail driven into weathered wood felt like reclaiming something more than just land. He patched up the sagging barn roof and cleared out the old tack room, his hands working with a determination fueled by equal parts guilt and hope. But at night, when the world quieted and the weight of memory settled like cold stone, George couldn't escape the haunting question, how had Duke ended up like this? The auctioneer's words gnawed at him, sharp and relentless, discarded by a previous owner. That wasn't just neglect. It was betrayal. Someone had thrown Duke away, as if he meant nothing. But who? And why? One evening, with the stars scattered. Across the velvet sky like shattered glass, George sat outside Duke's stall, the cool air biting at his skin. His voice broke the silence, low, rough and cracked with the strain of old wounds. "I thought you were gone, boy. All those years I searched. God knows I searched everywhere for you. And all this time you were still out there fighting to stay alive." His hand trembled slightly as he rested it against the stall door, close but not close enough to touch. "Who did this to you?" The only response was the soft rustle of hay and the rhythmic sound of Duke's breathing in the dark. The following days weighed heavier. The question clawed at George's mind, refusing to let go. His gut told him there was more to the story than a simple abandonment. Horses didn't just vanish. Someone had taken Duke from him, and someone had tried to break him. Then came the second breakthrough. George was repairing the old pasture gate when he heard it, hooves on packed earth, steady and deliberate. Turning, he saw Duke standing just beyond the fence, closer than he had ever dared to come before. His ears were perked forward, eyes sharp and curious instead of wary. George froze. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice like worn leather, rough but familiar. The stallion didn't shy away. His nostrils flared, catching George's scent, and for a moment the old fire sparked behind those dark eyes. Then, with hesitant steps, Duke inched closer to the gate. George didn't move, barely dared to breathe. The horse stretched his neck forward, muscles tight with hesitation, until his muzzle hovered near George's outstretched hand. It wasn't a full touch, but it was enough. A breath passed between them, soft and fragile. "I knew you were still in there," George whispered, but peace didn't last. That night a message came, a call from an old friend who had heard rumors. "That horse of yours, he was seen on Victor Nelson's land not too long ago." The name hit George like a fist to the gut. Victor Nelson, ruthless, rich, and as cold as the steel tips of his polished boots. A man who saw horses as nothing more than status symbols, tools for his daughter's fleeting amusements. And if Duke had somehow fallen into his hands... George felt the old anger rise like wildfire, burning through the years of loss and regret. The next day, George made the drive into town. The auctioneer, a wiry man with thinning hair and eyes too quick to avoid the truth, greeted him with forced politeness. "I need answers," George demanded, voice low and dangerous. "That horse, my horse, where did you get him?" The auctioneer's smile faltered. "Came from a private seller, said the horse wasn't worth keeping, too old, too wild, just wanted him gone." "Who?" The man swallowed hard. I don't know. It was anonymous, but the transport, it came from Nelson's ranch." Rage simmered just beneath George's skin. He left without another word. The drive back to the ranch felt endless, every second thick with fury and dread. That night, as he sat outside Duke's stall, George knew what he had to do. There was no turning away from the truth now. If Victor Nelson had tried to kill Duke, if he had discarded him like garbage, George wasn't going to let that stand. He placed a hand on the worn wood of the stall door and whispered, "I'm going to make this right, boy. I swear it." The wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the scent of coming rain and the weight of old reckonings. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning broke gray and sullen, the sky heavy with unspoken promises of a storm. George woke with the weight of determination pressing against his ribs, the memory of the auctioneer's reluctant confession still burning in his mind. He couldn't let this stand. Duke wasn't just a horse, he was family, a loyal companion who had once carried George across endless fields of gold, his spirit untamed and powerful. Now that same spirit had been beaten, scarred, and discarded by someone who didn't see his worth. Victor Nelson. The name hung like a noose around George's throat. But this wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. It was about giving Duke the dignity and peace he deserved. And maybe in doing that, George could find a way to mend the broken pieces of himself too. That afternoon, the clouds broke open. Rain fell in sheets, drenching the cracked earth, making the wooden fence posts glisten like dark bones jutting from the mud. George worked through it anyway, hauling feed, patching the last sagging fence. Panel, His hands rough and unyielding against the raw sting of the storm, Duke watched from the shelter of his stall, eyes shadowed with caution but no longer hollow. The fear was still there, but beneath it, something else stirred. Recognition, maybe. A fragile, hesitant trust. "Soon," George murmured to him between hammer strikes, "I'm going to fix this. For you. For both of us." The plan began to take shape that night as George sat at the old oak table inside his small, weather-worn house. The wood creaked beneath his elbows, the sound of rain tapping against the window like an anxious heartbeat. He needed to confront Victor, face him head on. But not with fury alone. That wouldn't get Duke justice. He needed proof, something undeniable. He started making calls, old friends, ranch hands, and anyone who had ever worked for Victor Nelson. Most didn't answer, and those who did were hesitant to talk. The mere mention of Victor's name carried a weight of fear and resentment. But eventually a voice on the other end, gravelly and hesitant, broke the silence. "George," the voice belonged to Tom Radley, a former stable hand who had worked for Victor years ago before disappearing off the grid. "Yeah, Tom. I need to know what happened to Duke. I know he was at Nelson's ranch." "I know something went down. You were there, weren't you?" A long pause crackled through the line. "You don't know what you're getting into, George?" "I don't care. That horse was my family, and that bastard tried to break him." Tom sighed, a sound heavy with guilt and regret. Victor? He didn't care about the horses, just the image. His daughter, she wanted a pony, something smaller, cuter. Duke was too old, too big. Victor said he wasn't worth the feed. One day I heard him give the order to get rid of that useless thing. I tried to stop it, but I wasn't enough. They beat him, George. Left him out in the canyons. Figured nature would finish the job. The words hit like a hammer to the chest. George's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. "But Duke didn't die," Tom continued. "That horse fought. To live. Somehow he found his way back from hell. But Victor doesn't care. He never will. You go after him, George. You'd better be ready to finish what you start." George hung up without another word. His hands shook, not from fear but from fury and sorrow, tangled into something raw and dangerous. The following days were consumed with preparation. Every inch of the ranch became part of the healing process, both for George and Duke. He spent hours with the stallion, brushing down his scarred coat, letting him feel the gentleness of a touch that didn't hurt. There were moments, fleeting but powerful, when Duke leaned into his hand, eyes soft and vulnerable, like a glimpse of the horse he used to be. The bond wasn't mended yet, but it was reforging, link by fragile link. One evening, as the sun bled across the sky in a brilliant wash of orange and crimson, George took a chance. He opened the corral gate and let Duke out into the open pasture. At first the stallion hesitated. His muscles were tense, coils of anxiety, nostrils flaring as if expecting some unseen danger to leap from the shadows. But George stood back, silent and patient. He let Duke choose, and then, slowly, cautiously, Duke stepped forward. The earth was soft beneath his hooves, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing in the wide, open sky. Then something shifted. His ears perked up, and with a sudden burst of energy, he took off, running, powerful legs carrying him across the pasture in long, elegant strides. The sight was breathtaking. Each movement carried echoes of the stallion Duke had once been. Proud, free, fierce. George felt something in his chest break open, raw and tender, as he watched the horse reclaim a sliver of himself beneath the open sky. "You're still in there," George thought, "and I'll bring you all the way back." The following morning, George loaded Duke into the old horse trailer. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but George knew what had to be done. It was time to face Victor Nelson. The drive was silent, except for the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of Duke shifting behind him. The land rolled out endlessly, wide stretches of desert and grassland, giving way to jagged canyons and towering cliffs. As they drew closer to Nelson's estate, the air grew heavy with tension, thick and oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Victor's ranch was as ostentatious as George remembered. White fences, pristine and unbroken, sprawling fields manicured within an inch of their lives. It was a far cry from George's humble, hard-working land. It was a place built on wealth and vanity, not love or respect for the creatures it housed. George pulled up just outside the main gate and cut the engine. His heart hammered in his chest, every beat echoing years of loss, anger, and guilt. He stepped out and waited moments. Later, the front door swung open, and there he was. Victor Nelson, older now, but still carrying that same smug arrogance in every inch of his posture. His sharp features were untouched by regret or remorse. "George Callahan," Victor drawled, voice slick as oil. "Didn't expect to see you crawling out of your little hole. What brings you here?" George didn't waste time. "You know why I'm here. You tried to kill my horse." Victor's expression barely flickered. "That old nag? You're still hung up on that worthless beast?" George took a step forward, fists clenched. "He wasn't worthless. You tried to break him, left him for dead. But he survived. And I'm not leaving until I get justice for him," Victor laughed, a cold, sharp sound. "Justice? You think anyone gives a damn about some broken-down animal?" "I do," George growled, voice low and deadly. "And you're going to pay for what you did, one way or another." The air crackled with tension, thick enough to suffocate. Victor's smug smile faltered for the first time. George knew this wasn't just about Duke anymore. It was about standing up for every creature Victor had ever discarded, every ounce of cruelty he had dealt without consequence. And this time there would be no running. The reckoning had begun. For a long, terrible heartbeat, the two men stood in the heavy silence, tension thick enough to drown in. The storm had rolled in behind them both, clouds like bruises stretching across the sky, wind cutting sharp and cold. The earth smelled of rain and reckoning, as if the land itself understood what was about to unfold. Victor Nelson's sneer barely wavered, but there was something hollow behind his eyes now, an uneasy glimmer of recognition that this wasn't the same man he'd dismissed all those years ago. George Callahan wasn't here with empty threats or weak hands. He was here with years of pain carved deep into his bones and something far stronger than rage fueling him: justice. "I don't have time for the whining of an old man who can't let go of the past," Victor finally said, turning to leave, arrogance dripping from every word. George took a step forward, voice like gravel grinding against steel. "You're not walking away from this." Victor paused, glancing over his shoulder with the faintest flicker of irritation, an ember of fear hidden deep behind his smug expression. "And what are you going to do? Press charges over a horse? It's your word against mine. No one's going to care." George didn't blink. "I've got more than my word." The gates behind him creaked as the old truck rumbled forward, and Tom Radley stepped out, his face drawn and lined with guilt that had been weighing on him for years. Alongside him came two more ranch hands, men who had worked under Victor's command and had finally found the courage to speak out. "Thought you might remember some of your old employees," George said coldly. "Seems like you've left. More than one person with scars." Victor's composure cracked, barely, but it was there. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed like a snake, cornered by the very prey it had once underestimated. "They're lying. Bitter nobodies with a grudge. You think anyone's going to believe them?" George didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned and unlatched the trailer door. The moment Duke stepped down onto the earth, the entire atmosphere shifted. The stallion emerged like a force of nature. Scarred, yes, but not broken. His chestnut coat, dull from years of neglect, still shimmered faintly under the weak sunlight that managed to break through the clouds. His dark eyes locked on to Victor, and something primal passed between them, an acknowledgment of what had. been done and what had survived despite it, Victor took an unconscious step back. "He's proof enough," George said, his voice quiet but carrying more weight than any threat ever could. Duke didn't need words. His presence alone spoke volumes of survival, of resilience, of pain endured and defied. But George wasn't finished. "I've spoken with the sheriff. You think nobody cares? There are animal cruelty laws in this state, and with witness statements, proof of ownership, and Duke himself standing here." "You're done." For the first time, Victor's composure shattered entirely. His face paled, and he turned no longer the arrogant rancher, but a man desperately searching for an exit that didn't exist, but there was nowhere left to run. The legal battle that followed was long and bitter, but the outcome was inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies, veterinary reports confirming Duke's old injuries matched the time Victor had discarded him, and ownership records that proved Duke had been George's horse all along. In the end, Victor Nelson was stripped of his rights to own livestock. Fines and criminal charges followed. His empire, built on cruelty masked by wealth, crumbled piece by piece under the weight of the truth. But for George, the victory wasn't in courtrooms or legal declarations. The real victory was quieter. It was watching Duke roam freely across his land again, every stride carrying echoes of the horse he used to be, and glimpses of the horse he could become once more. Weeks turned to months. The ranch began to bloom back to life. The fences were repaired, the barn restored, and the fields, once brittle with neglect, grew thick with grass. But more than that, George changed. There was light in his eyes again, subtle but steady, like a sunrise over worn-out hills. Duke's. Recovery wasn't easy. Trauma left its marks, nervous flinches, restless nights, moments when the old fear clawed back from the shadows. But every day brought small victories. The first time Duke let George brush him without hesitation. The first time he galloped across the pasture with the wild joy of his younger years. The first time he rested his head against George's chest, breathing slow and steady, their bond, fractured by years of pain, was reforging, stronger and deeper than before, not built on dominance or expectation, but on trust, resilience, and the simple, unspoken promise that neither of them would be abandoned again. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the open sky, George saddled Duke for the first time in years. The stallion stood steady as George eased into the saddle, every muscle tense with anticipation, but not fear. Trust hummed in the air between them, strong and quiet as the wind. They rode together across the open field, hooves drumming a steady, powerful rhythm into the earth. Every stride felt like reclaiming something lost, time, hope, and the unbreakable bond between man and horse. The wind whipped through George's hair, carrying the scent of wild grass and freedom. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, the sky had deepened into a tapestry of twilight blues and fiery oranges. George dismounted, resting a hand on Duke's neck, feeling the warmth of the horse's breath against his palm. "You made it home, boy," George whispered. His voice cracked under the weight of it all, years of guilt, loss, and the stubborn, relentless hope that had finally led them here. Duke turned his head, nuzzling into George's chest, a quiet gesture of understanding and forgiveness. The storm had passed. The wounds remained, but they no longer bled. Time moved forward, as it always did. Victor Nelson faded into memory, a name that no longer carried power or fear. The ranch flourished, not in wealth, but in something far more valuable: healing, redemption, and peace. George spent his days tending the land and his evenings with Duke under skies stitched with stars. Sometimes he would sit by the pasture fence and just watch the stallion run, each stride a testament to survival, each breath a reminder that even the deepest scars could heal. There was no grandeur in their story, no parades or riches, just quiet moments of trust rebuilt, of land reclaimed, of two souls man and horse, finding their way back from the brink. And that was enough. As dusk settled on the horizon, painting the world in soft shadows and fading, George leaned against the fence, eyes closed, listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of Duke's hooves across the earth. Freedom wasn't in forgetting the pain, it was in overcoming it, and together they had. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.